Number 1. Maria de Lourdes Sosa. It was summer in Montgomery County, Texas, when officers led a 50-year-old boxing coach into a patch of scrubland and asked him to lie down in the dirt. It was late July of 2015. Ramon Sosa wore only his underwear, his hands positioned behind his back as if they had been tied. A makeup artist darkened one side of his face and painted a fake bullet wound near his temple. Detectives dusted his body with soil to make it look as though he had been dumped in a shallow grave. Then they stepped back and started taking photographs. In every frame, Sosa appeared dead. In reality, he was obeying instructions from law enforcement, helping them document a murder-for-hire plot that, if it had gone undiscovered, could have ended his life. The images were not meant for the public. They were meant for one person, the woman police believed had hired a hitman to kill him. Within hours, an undercover officer posing as that hitman parked in a retail lot north of Houston near a strip of shops off Rayford Road. It was the same area Sosa and his wife knew well from running their boxing gym. The officer carried the staged grave photo in an envelope and a hidden camera on his body. Investigators watched from unmarked vehicles as a woman in her mid-40s arrived and waited in her car. Her name was Maria de Lourdes Sosa, Ramon's estranged wife. She thought she was meeting the man who had just murdered her husband. Years earlier, their lives had looked very different. Sosa, originally from Puerto Rico, had spent his youth fighting professionally before turning to coaching. By the mid-2000s, he was living in the Houston area, training fighters and building a reputation as a disciplined, energetic boxing trainer. Around 2007, at a salsa club, he met Lulu, a Mexican-born single mother who had been working cleaning jobs and massage work to support her children. They started dating, married in March 2009, and tried to build a shared future. In 2010, they opened Woodlands Boxing and Fitness, a gym that attracted hundreds of clients and provided a steady income. The couple bought a 2-story home, brought Lulu's family to live with them, and presented themselves as a successful, blended household in the northern suburbs of Houston. Within a few years, the relationship began to unravel. Sosa later said that about 3 years into the marriage, he noticed growing tension and arguments, particularly around spending and control of the business. By early 2015, the situation had deteriorated into what attorneys later described as a highly contentious divorce. Court filings and later commentary indicate that the gym, the house, and the income it generated were all in dispute. In March 2015, Lulu formally filed for divorce. Around that time, she began complaining bitterly about Ramon to one of his closest friends, a man known as Mundo. He had grown up around gangs in East Houston, but was now training at the gym and trying to turn his life around. According to Mundo's later account, one evening he overheard Lulu speaking with her teenage daughter at the gym about knowing a big shot in Mexico who cuts up bodies and hearing Ramon's name in the same conversation. When he confronted her privately, she claimed Ramon was abusive and said she wished he would disappear. She then asked a direct question: could he help her find someone to get rid of her husband? For Lulu, Mundo's past made him useful. For investigators, his decision in that moment changed the course of the case. Mundo told her he would help, and the next day went straight to Ramon and then to law enforcement. From that point on, every meeting would be recorded, and every step would be taken with investigators listening. Detectives arranged for Mundo to act as a go-between. He wore a wire while he met with Lulu, discussing what she wanted done. Recordings captured her, making it clear that she wanted more than a threat or a beating. She wanted her husband dead. When officers were satisfied that the threat was real, they introduced an undercover officer to pose as a hired killer. In a meeting in that Rayford Road area, Lulu sat in a vehicle and spoke with the supposed hitman about how the murder should happen. Reports and later court records indicate she offered about $2,000 for the killing, along with Ramon's pickup truck and additional property. She handed over an initial payment of several $100s and one of Ramon's rings as a sign she was serious. At one point, when the undercover officer asked if she simply wanted her husband roughed up, she answered clearly that she wanted him dead. The staged grave photos were the final piece of evidence. After photographing Sosa in the dirt outside town, detectives printed the images and gave them to the undercover officer. In their follow-up meeting in the parking lot, he told Lulu the job had been completed. Hidden cameras recorded him laying the photograph in her hands. The image showed Ramon apparently lifeless, his hands behind his back, dirt on his body, and a visible wound on his head. According to investigators and later television interviews, her reaction was not shock or hesitation. She studied the photo, laughed or smiled, and then paid the remaining money that had been agreed upon. For detectives watching the feed, it was the confirmation they needed that she believed her husband had been killed because of her actions. The arrest came quickly. The day after that meeting, in late July 2015, officers moved in and took Lulu into custody. She was charged with criminal solicitation of capital murder under Texas law and held in the Montgomery County Jail. Local coverage at the time noted that investigators believed she might have discussed the idea with other people before approaching Mundo and asked any additional witnesses to come forward. While she waited in custody, prosecutors organized the case around recordings, photographs, and physical evidence gathered during the sting. There was no mystery suspect and no missing weapon. The central question was whether the woman on the tapes had truly tried to arrange her husband's killing. 15 months later, in October 2016, Lulu appeared in a state district courtroom in Conroe, Texas, to enter a plea. Facing a potential life sentence if convicted at trial, she agreed to plead guilty to a reduced charge of criminal solicitation of murder, a second-degree felony. The judge accepted the plea agreement and sentenced her to 20 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. In court, Ramon delivered a victim impact statement describing how he had listened to the recordings, learned about the staged meetings, and seen the photos of his own death. He told the judge that he struggled with the knowledge that someone he had married and built a business with had tried to have him killed. He also said he forgave her, but that forgiveness did not change the sentence or the legal conclusion. In the years since, Lulu has remained in state custody, serving a sentence of up to 20 years for her role in the plot. Various public records and later reporting place her in a women's prison in Gatesville, Texas, with projected release dates depending on parole and good time calculations. Ramon kept the gym after the divorce was finalized and later began speaking publicly about the case, using his experience to talk about abusive and manipulative relationships and the warning signs he says he missed. The evidence that shaped the outcome was not a single confession or a disputed eyewitness account. It was a sequence of deliberate steps. A friend who chose to cooperate with police, recorded conversations that captured the planning, a staged grave that produced photographic proof, and a parking lot meeting where payment was handed over for a killing that never happened. Lulu believed she had solved her problems by hiring a hitman. Instead, every move she made was documented by law enforcement, ending not with her husband's death in a shallow grave, but with a 20-year prison sentence for a murder-for-hire plot that failed before the first shot was ever fired. Number 2. Wanda Holloway. It was a quiet winter night in Channelview, Texas, when Terry Harper sat in his living room, replaying the conversation he had just had with his former sister-in-law. He had known Wanda Holloway for years, long enough to understand her moods, her ambitions, and her talent for turning small frustrations into consuming battles. But nothing he had heard in that conversation prepared him for what she said that evening. Wanda wanted him to help her find someone to kill a woman. Not a stranger, not an enemy from her past, but the mother of a 13-year-old girl who happened to be her daughter's cheerleading rival. Harper sat there, stunned, trying to decide whether she had said it out of anger or whether she genuinely meant it. Before the night was over, he realized she wasn't joking. She repeated the idea more than once. She wanted Verna Heath dead, because if Verna died, Wanda believed her daughter Shanna would finally have a clear path to making the junior high cheerleading squad. She wasn't asking in metaphor. She wasn't asking for advice. She was asking for a murder. The intensity of Wanda's fixation didn't appear overnight. In Channelview, cheerleading was its own kind of hierarchy, part athletics, part social currency, part small-town stage where parents invested time, money, and pride. Wanda had pushed Shanna for years. Private lessons, early uniforms, practice schedules arranged around the dream of seeing her daughter in the coveted uniform. But the dream always collided with the same obstacle. Amber Heath, a bright, well-liked girl who tended to score higher than Shanna at tryouts. Wanda believed the Heath family had advantages she did not. She talked about them often, and not kindly. By late 1990, the resentment had hardened into obsession. Wanda first raised the idea of eliminating Amber directly. Harper testified that she told him she wanted Amber out of the picture. He rejected the idea immediately. Killing a child wasn't something even Wanda dared to pursue. But she recalibrated quickly, and in that recalibration came the moment that would define the case. She proposed killing Verna, the girl's mother, instead. "If the mother dies," she told Harper, "Amber will be too upset to cheer." The logic, twisted, clinical, chilling, reflects exactly what prosecutors would later argue in court, that Wanda saw murder as a strategic solution to a cheerleading rivalry. She didn't rant. She didn't break down. She laid out the plan plainly, as though she had reasoned through it long before saying it aloud. Harper, disturbed by what he had heard, went to the authorities. Investigators instructed him to meet with Wanda again and record their conversations. Over the next series of meetings, he captured hours of incriminating exchanges. On the tapes, Wanda discussed the arrangement with the calm detachment of someone sorting out a complicated errand. She offered a diamond ring, valued between $1,500 and $2,000, as partial payment. She worried aloud about the murder being traced back to her. She talked about timing and opportunity. At no point did she pull back. In one tape, when Harper asked whether she was serious, she said yes, completely serious. With the recordings in hand, Harris County investigators planned a sting. On the 28th of January 1991, after another meeting between Harper and Wanda, deputies moved in and arrested her. She was still carrying the jewelry she intended to use as payment. That object, the ring, became one of the most enduring symbols of the case, a piece of suburban gold offered up in exchange for a life. The case exploded across the country almost instantly. Newspapers ran headlines about the cheerleader mom who tried to have a rival's mother killed. The facts seemed almost surreal, absurd if they weren't so well documented. But the story was grounded in real evidence, tapes, witnesses, and the words Wanda used herself. The trial, held later that year, lasted only long enough for jurors to hear the recordings and see the lengths she had gone to. She was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But the story did not end there. In 1993, an appellate court overturned the conviction because a juror failed to disclose his connection to the Holloway family. The error was serious enough to invalidate the verdict. Wanda, now facing a second trial, agreed to plead no contest in 1996 to solicitation of capital murder. Under the terms of the new sentence, she received a 10-year term, of which she served 6 months in jail and the remainder on probation. What lingered long after the sentencing was the question prosecutors raised repeatedly during both trials. How far could a parent's competitive drive go before it became something darker? In the recordings, Wanda spoke about killing Verna as if it were a necessary adjustment to the cheerleading landscape, as though removing an opponent's mother was no more consequential than replacing a coach or joining another booster club. Her voice on the tapes was level, deliberate, certain. No one was harmed. Verna Heath lived. Amber stayed on the cheer squad unharmed. Shanna Holloway never had to bear the weight of knowing her mother had tried to kill for her benefit. The only life truly altered was Wanda's own, derailed not by a moment of madness, but by a series of decisions spoken aloud, recorded, and delivered into a courtroom. It began with a conversation in a living room. It ended with a case that would become a national shorthand for obsessive ambition, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous motives are the ones wrapped in the most ordinary grievances. Number 3. Dalia Dippolito. It was just after 8 o'clock on a warm August morning in Boynton Beach, Florida, when police units began positioning themselves outside a 2-story townhome in a quiet residential development. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the walkway. Patrol cars idled with their lights flashing. Plainclothes detectives moved purposefully between parked vehicles, creating the unmistakable look of an active homicide investigation. Inside the home, no body lay on the floor. No shots had been fired. The blood they described did not exist. This was a staged crime scene, an elaborate, carefully constructed ruse designed to record the reaction of one person, 26-year-old Dalia Dippolito, who police believed had just paid to have her husband murdered. A few minutes later, officers placed a call to her cell phone. They told her there had been a break-in, that she needed to return home immediately, and that something had happened to her husband, Michael Dippolito. Surveillance cameras captured her car pulling into the lot. She stepped out, walked toward the tape and was stopped by a uniformed officer who delivered the news with rehearsed professionalism. Michael had been killed. The footage shows her dropping her handbag, collapsing into an officer's arms, and sobbing as detectives guided her away. Behind her, cameras from the police department and from the television show Cops recorded everything. What she didn't know, what only the officers knew, was that Michael was safe at the police station, alive and cooperating. The entire display was part of a sting operation that had begun weeks earlier, when investigators learned that Dahlia was trying to hire a hitman to kill him. To understand how she ended up standing in front of fake crime scene tape, it helps to understand the relationship that led her there. Dahlia had met Michael in late 2008, when he was still married and rebuilding his life after serving time for a telemarketing fraud scheme. Their relationship escalated quickly. Michael divorced his wife and married Dahlia just days later. By early 2009, they were living together in his Boynton Beach townhome. He was in his late 30s, on probation until 2032, and working to avoid further trouble with the law. She was in her mid-20s, glamorous, social, and, according to friends and later testimony, growing increasingly dissatisfied with the constraints of married life. Michael would later describe a series of strange events in the months before the sting. Anonymous calls to police alleged he was selling drugs. Officers conducted traffic stops, searched his vehicle, and even found narcotics inside. Michael insisted they were planted, and in time, he began to suspect his own wife was behind the reports. Prosecutors would later point to this pattern as an early attempt by Dahlia to get him violated on probation. In that same period, she confided in a man she had been seeing romantically, Mohammed Shihadeh, telling him bluntly that she wanted Michael gone. Shihadeh, alarmed by her persistence, went to the Boynton Beach Police Department and told detectives she was trying to hire someone to kill her husband. He agreed to act as a confidential informant. Detectives equipped Shihadeh with recording devices and instructed him to gather more evidence. On the videos preserved for trial, Dahlia speaks calmly about how she wants the murder handled. She gives Shihadeh photographs of Michael and $1,200 to buy a handgun. She talks about timing, about not wanting to be home when the killing happens, and about setting up an alibi. The conversations leave investigators convinced the threat is real. That's when they introduce an undercover detective, Whitey Jean, posing as a professional hitman. The meetings between Dahlia and the undercover officer take place in casual suburban settings: a drugstore parking lot, a gas station, the front seat of a car. Each conversation is recorded. She hands him $3,000 in cash, a key to the townhome, and describes the layout of the residence. She outlines Michael's schedule, when he leaves, when he sleeps, when he goes to the gym. She discusses the alarm system, the unlocked door, and how the job should be done while she is away at the gym, so she will have an airtight alibi. Before leaving one meeting, Detective Jean asks her to be absolutely certain about what she is requesting, warning that once today passes, there will be no turning back. Her response becomes one of the most quoted lines in the case. "I'm determined already. I'm positive. I'm 5,000% sure." She smiles, she nods, she tells him she understands. For detectives, there is no ambiguity left. The sting concludes on the morning the killing is supposed to occur. Police remove Michael from the home and bring him to the station for protection. Then they stage the homicide outside the townhome so convincingly that even seasoned officers later describe the scene as unsettling. When Dahlia arrives and collapses into tears, officers let the performance continue long enough to document her reaction before bringing her to the department for questioning. In the interrogation room, Detective Jean enters and tells her Michael is alive. The look on her face, shock, disbelief, then confusion, has been replayed in countless broadcasts. She denies everything, insists she didn't do anything, and claims she never wanted her husband dead. But detectives confront her with video, audio, and the undercover officer she had tried to hire. She is arrested on the spot for solicitation to commit first-degree murder. The legal battle that follows spans nearly a decade. In 2011, a jury sees the recordings of her meetings, the staged crime scene footage, and the cash she provided. They convict her, and the judge sentences her to 20 years. That conviction is overturned in 2014 on procedural grounds involving jury selection and media exposure. A second trial in 2016 ends in a mistrial when the jury deadlocks. At a third trial in 2017, prosecutors present the same core evidence, her own recorded planning and unambiguous statements. They also introduce testimony from Shihadeh that she once claimed to have tried to poison Michael with antifreeze. After deliberation, the jury finds her guilty again. This time, the judge sentences her to 16 years in state prison. An appellate court upholds the conviction in 2019, rejecting her arguments that police entrapped her or acted improperly for the sake of television. Today, Dalia Dipolito remains incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution. Michael survived the plot and eventually rebuilt his life. But the case remains one of the most widely recognized murder-for-hire stings in modern policing, an example of what happens when a supposed mastermind attempts to orchestrate a killing while investigators quietly record every step. The staged crime scene, the covert recordings, the undercover meetings, and the viral footage all point to the same conclusion. The murder she believed she had arranged never took place, because the only people she trusted to carry it out were the very officers who would ultimately arrest her. Number 4. Valerie Cicinelli. It was a gray May morning on Long Island when federal agents led a man into a parked car and asked him to play dead. They positioned him behind the wheel, slumped his body to the side, and marked his clothing with what looked like bullet wounds. In the photographs that followed, he appeared lifeless, head down, blood on his shirt, the frame tight enough that no one could see the agents standing just outside the door. The man in the pictures was Isaiah Carvalho Jr., and he was very much alive. The FBI needed the images not to convince a jury, at least not yet, but to test the reaction of the person they believed had arranged for his murder, his estranged wife, Valerie Cicinelli, a 12-year veteran of the New York City Police Department. Months earlier, Cicinelli's personal life had fractured into overlapping conflicts. She was in the middle of a bitter divorce from Carvalho, arguing over money, support, and access. At the same time, she was seeing another man, John DeRubba, a car dealer from Long Island. Friends and investigators would later describe a mix of financial pressure, jealousy, and control running through those relationships. She complained that Carvalho was costing her money. She complained that DeRubba's teenage daughter resented her and interfered with their time together. According to federal court records, those complaints moved beyond private arguments. In the fall and winter leading into 2019, she began asking DeRubba directly if he knew someone who could kill her husband. What she did not know was that DeRubba grew alarmed enough to contact authorities. He went to the FBI and told agents that his girlfriend, an active NYPD officer, had repeatedly talked about hiring a hitman. Agents turned him into a confidential informant, equipped him with recording devices, and instructed him to keep talking to her. In recorded conversations, she returned to the same subjects: how much it would cost, when it could happen, how she could be elsewhere when it did. At one point, according to an affidavit later filed in federal court, she discussed using money withdrawn from her NYPD retirement account to pay for the job. She wanted Carvalho killed, she said, so that the financial and legal pressure tied to their divorce would disappear. The case took a darker turn when the subject expanded. In additional recorded conversations, she raised the idea of a second murder, the teenage daughter of her boyfriend. She described the girl as an obstacle, someone who came between her and DeRubba, someone she wanted, out of the picture. For agents listening to the recordings, this meant they were no longer dealing with a single intended victim. They now had a sitting police officer talking about arranging the deaths of both her estranged husband and a minor. By early May 2019, the FBI had enough recordings to attempt a controlled sting. They asked Carvalho to cooperate and staged the photo of his supposed killing in his car. Then, on May 17th, they moved to put the plan in motion. An undercover agent, posing as the hired killer, sent proof of the job to DeRubba. Another message, formatted to look like it came from someone in law enforcement, informed Cicinelli that there had been a shooting and that her husband had been found dead. She was told police were now investigating the homicide. Federal agents monitored her phone and her conversations to see how she would respond. According to the government's later account, she did not react with shock or confusion. Instead, she began discussing what to do about the phones used to communicate with the supposed hitman. In one conversation, she instructed DeRubba to destroy his device so there would be no record tying them to the arrangement. That instruction, an explicit attempt to get rid of evidence, became a critical piece of the eventual charge she would face. Agents arrested her later that day. News of the alleged plot spread quickly because of who she was and who she targeted: an NYPD officer accused of trying to have both an estranged husband and a teenage girl killed. The original federal complaint charged her with using interstate commerce facilities to arrange murders for hire. The case file detailed the recordings, the staged death photo, and her instruction to destroy the phone. She was suspended from the NYPD and held without bail while the case moved forward. Over the next 2 years, lawyers argued over evidence and possible defenses. Cincinnati's legal team disputed parts of the government's narrative. Prosecutors, however, focused on the recordings and the obstruction that came after she believed the killing had taken place. In March 2021, rather than go to trial on the murder for hire counts, she entered a plea agreement. The government agreed to drop those charges if she pleaded guilty to a single federal count of obstruction of justice, specifically for her efforts to get DeRubba to destroy the phone that contained communications about the planned killings. At sentencing in April 2021, in a Brooklyn federal courtroom, prosecutors described a pattern of deliberate planning. They emphasized that she had not only discussed having her husband killed, but had also extended that intent to a child. They pointed to her experience as a police officer, arguing that she understood exactly what evidence mattered and why she had moved quickly to eliminate it once she believed her husband was dead. The judge, noting both the seriousness of the conduct and the plea agreement's terms, sentenced her to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. With credit for time already served since 2019 and standard good time reductions, she would go on to serve roughly 2.5 years before being released under supervision. The man in the car that May morning walked away from the staged scene and later from the courthouse. The teenage girl who had been discussed on those recordings was never harmed. No shots were fired. The only person whose life changed in the way the plot originally envisioned was the plotter herself. Instead of erasing a husband and a child from her life, Valerie Cincinnati lost her career, her freedom, and her future as a police officer, brought down by an undercover operation that turned her own planning, her own words, and her own attempt to erase the evidence into proof that the murder for hire scheme had failed before it ever had a chance to leave the page of an FBI file. Number 5. Wendy Lynn Wine. It was a quiet Friday afternoon in South Rockwood, Michigan, when an undercover state trooper eased his unmarked car into a small parking lot outside a roadside cafe. The air was warm, the lot mostly empty, the kind of place where a brief meeting would go unnoticed. Inside the vehicle sat a recorder, a concealed camera, and an officer posing as a man willing to commit murder for cash. Michigan State Police were watching from a distance, waiting to see whether the woman who had contacted a website called rentahitman.com would show up and follow through on what she had written in her message. She wanted her ex-husband dead. A few minutes later, a middle-aged woman in a gray top and jeans walked across the lot, looking around before approaching the undercover car. She opened the passenger door, sat down, and began talking. Her voice was steady. She explained that her ex-husband lived out of state, that he had caused her problems for years, and that she wanted the trooper to take care of it. She offered $5,000 for the job. When the officer asked whether she understood what she was requesting, she confirmed that she did. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out $200 in cash, handing it over as a down payment for the killing. She provided his address, schedule, and the best time to find him. Everything she said was recorded. When she stepped out of the car, Michigan State Police officers moved in and arrested her. Her name was Wendy Lynn Wine, 51 years old, from South Rockwood. The truth is that the plot had begun weeks earlier on a website never intended for criminal use. Rentahitman.com, created years before as a parody with fabricated testimonials and security badges, is filled with jokes obvious to anyone reading closely. But over time, it attracted a surprising number of real would-be criminals. Its owner, Bob Innes, eventually turned the website into a honeypot, forwarding genuine murder solicitations to law enforcement. When Wine visited the site in the summer of 2020, she filled out a service request form under a false name but entered her real identifying information at the end. She described her ex-husband as the issue she needed resolved. Innes sent her a polite follow-up email, a tactic he used to determine whether inquiries were real. Wine replied, confirming her intentions. He forwarded the information immediately to Michigan State Police. Investigators opened a case, reviewing the form she had submitted and the details she provided. They found that Wine had supplied her ex-husband's home and work addresses, along with notes on his routine and approximate location out of state. Prosecutors later said these details demonstrated both planning and clarity. There was no ambiguity. She wanted him dead, and she believed she had found someone online who would do it for a modest fee. When the undercover trooper contacted her, Wine didn't hesitate. She arranged to meet him in person, choosing a cafe's parking lot in Monroe County. According to the police report, she reiterated her desire for her ex-husband's murder and explained how payment would work. She said she could provide the remaining balance once the job was completed. Investigators listened in real time as she offered the $200 travel expense deposit. It was a clean, controlled operation, low risk, high documentation, and immediate confirmation of her intent. After the arrest on July 17, 2020, Wine was charged with solicitation to commit murder, a life maximum felony in Michigan, as well as using a computer to commit a crime. The computer charge reflected the digital paper trail she left behind, the website submission, the follow-up email, and the communication logs tied to the sting. During pretrial proceedings, prosecutors emphasized how straightforward the evidence was. They had the website form, they had her messages, they had the undercover meeting and the recorded exchange of cash. And they had her own words describing how, when, and why she wanted her ex-husband killed. In November 2021, facing trial, Wine pleaded guilty to both charges under an agreement that capped her minimum sentence at 9 years. The judge retained discretion over the maximum, and in January 2022, in a Monroe County courtroom, he sentenced her to 7 to 20 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. Wine received credit for the time she had already spent in custody, 545 days. She told the court she accepted responsibility but offered no explanation for why she had turned to a website known more for satire than serious criminal enterprise. For prosecutors, the case stood as one more example of how murder-for-hire plots collapse under the weight of their own simplicity. Wine had not searched for a black market contact or an underworld connection. She had typed her request into a publicly accessible website whose logo includes jokes about customer satisfaction. She left her real name. She met a stranger in a parking lot. She handed over cash. And every step was watched by the same law enforcement officers who would later escort her into court. In the end, no one was harmed. Not her ex-husband, not neighbors, not bystanders. The only damage was done to Wine herself, who entered the parking lot believing she was taking the first step toward arranging a killing, and instead walked directly into a fully documented sting. The site she thought would deliver a murderer delivered detectives. The hitman she paid was a trooper wearing a microphone, and the plan she believed was quietly unfolding collapsed the moment she pressed send on a website never meant to answer the request she made. Number 6. Mohammed A.H. Mohammed. It was just after midday in Hoover, Alabama, when a 64-year-old plumber named Mohammed A.H. Mohammed sat across from a man he believed could solve the problem that had consumed him for years. They met in a parking lot, the kind of place where a brief conversation could pass unnoticed, where no one would think twice about two men talking through an open car window. The man Mohammed had come to see looked like someone who knew how to make people disappear. He spoke softly, asked direct questions, and didn't react when Mohammed began listing the people he wanted dead, his estranged wife, and their 6 adult children. The agent, because that's what he really was, an undercover FBI operative, let him talk. Mohammed leaned forward, lowering his voice as he described each intended target. He had brought photographs, addresses, vehicle descriptions, the kind of details someone would need to track a person down. When the agent asked about payment, Mohammed quoted prices without hesitation: $20,000 to kill his wife, $5,000 for each of the 6 children. He called them names, trash, cockroaches, and said his pride had been destroyed. According to the recordings later submitted in court, he told the agent to start with 1 and to take your time. Before the meeting ended, he slid $550 across the seat as a down payment. The rest, he promised, would come within 2 weeks. Federal agents were listening the entire time. The road to that meeting began years earlier, long before Mohammed walked into a parking lot carrying envelopes and photographs. Court records show a trail of fear inside the family home: threats, controlling behavior, and allegations of violence. Not long after the marriage in 2021, his wife and several of the adult children secured protection from abuse orders, telling judges they feared what he might do. One child said he had put a gun to her head. Another said he had threatened to kill them all in the basement. When the wife later separated from him and initiated divorce proceedings, the conflict escalated. In 2022, police arrested him for first-degree stalking after investigators found GPS trackers hidden on vehicles belonging to his wife and children, devices placed in violation of the court orders. By early 2023, vehicles belonging to members of the family began catching fire in suspicious overnight arsons. A friend's car burned first, then one of his son's trucks. Months later, more vehicles went up in flames. Another son's car and 3 additional vehicles damaged in a single night. Investigators were already watching him closely, and surveillance footage from one of the scenes captured a vehicle tied to him. In December of that same year, he made a brief attempt at reconciliation. His wife received a call from a man speaking on Muhammad's behalf, asking if she would consider meeting with him. She refused. Less than 12 hours later, her daughter's Toyota Avalon was torched in another suspicious fire. When Muhammad was arrested on state charges soon after, a witness confronted him, telling him he would go to hell if he hurt his family. According to court testimony, he replied, "No, God will reward me." By February 2024, Muhammad was out on bond, wearing an ankle monitor and awaiting trial on state counts. The family believed they were safe only because courts were watching him. What they didn't know was that he was already planning something far worse than surveillance and property damage. In August 2024, he approached a person he trusted, someone who would later become a cooperating witness. He asked them if they knew anyone who could take care of his wife and children. The witness later told federal agents that Muhammad repeated the request several times, making clear that he wanted the entire family gone. The witness contacted law enforcement, and the FBI launched a controlled undercover operation. In September, agents introduced Muhammad to a man they described as a professional hitman. They recorded every word of their meetings. Muhammad treated the undercover agent as a contractor, someone he could negotiate with. He laid out the hierarchy of who should die first. He identified his wife as the main one, the big head, the one who would cost $20,000. The children, he said, were the smaller jobs, $5,000 each. He emphasized that when they died, he would regain the dignity he believed they had stolen from him. He gave the agent printed photographs of all 7 targets and confirmed their routines. He spoke as though he were ordering a service, not arranging the murders of 7 people who shared his blood. After the final meeting, when the down payment had changed hands and the plan was fully documented, the FBI moved in. On September 24, 2024, agents arrested him with the Hoover Police Department. The U.S. Attorney's Office announced a federal indictment shortly after. At 63 years old, he was charged with murder for hire under the federal statute that criminalizes using interstate communication to arrange a killing. 1 year later, in September 2025, Muhammad stood in a federal courtroom and pleaded guilty to 7 counts, 1 for each intended victim. He now faces up to 10 years per count, a possible 70-year sentence. His sentencing is scheduled for December. None of the people he targeted were harmed. His estranged wife and 6 children are alive because at every step, during the solicitation, during the meetings, during the handoff of photos and money, law enforcement was there, listening, documenting, recording. The man Muhammad believed was a hitman was an FBI agent. The person he trusted to find a killer went to the authorities instead. What remains is a case defined by a chilling level of planning and a catastrophic failure. A father prepared to wipe out his entire family, undone by the very first person he tried to recruit. A sting operation that captured every detail. And a man who walked into a parking lot believing he was buying a path back to his dignity, only to spend the rest of his life fighting to keep a fraction of his freedom. Number 7. Lindsay Shirley Shiver. It began with a phone pulled from the pocket of a man suspected of breaking into a small business on the island of Abaco. Bahamian officers scrolled past call logs and photos, expecting to find evidence of stolen goods or associates linked to the burglary. Instead, they opened a WhatsApp chat and froze. On the screen was a photograph of an American man sitting at a bar. Underneath it, a message read, "Kill him." The sender's name was one the detectives didn't recognize, Lindsay Shiver, but that would change within hours. That single message would unravel an alleged murder-for-hire plot that crossed borders, involved a love affair, and started a cascade of arrests that would eventually reach all the way to Georgia. Lindsay Shiver was 36 years old, a former beauty queen turned stay-at-home mother of 3, living what appeared to be an affluent Southern life in Thomasville, Georgia. But behind that picture were months of marital collapse and a divorce filled with accusations from both sides. Court filings show that her husband, Robert "Rob" Shiver, a former Auburn football player and insurance executive, had accused her of infidelity. Lindsay, in turn, accused him of emotional and physical abuse. Their conflict spread into financial disputes, custody battles, and bitter courtroom filings that stretched across 2 countries once Lindsay began spending extended periods of time in the Bahamas. It was there, on Guana Cay in the Abaco Islands, that she met Terrence Bethel, a local restaurant employee who would become her romantic partner. To friends and co-workers on the island, the relationship was open and visible. But according to Bahamian police, the anger surrounding the divorce followed Lindsay wherever she went. Investigators would later tell courts that the WhatsApp messages recovered from the break-in suspect's phone included conversations between Lindsay, Bethel, and a third man, Farron Newbold Jr., discussing ways to murder Rob. The messages did not suggest hesitation. They included discussions about timing, opportunity, and the location of the intended victim. And then there was the photo Lindsay allegedly sent. Rob at a bar, unaware that the image was being used for a purpose prosecutors say was clear. Based on those messages, Bahamian law enforcement launched a separate investigation. On July 21, 2023, officers arrested Lindsay, Bethel, and Newbold on Abaco and transported them to Nassau. All 3 were charged with conspiracy to commit murder under Bahamian law. They were taken to the Bahamas Department of Correctional Services, commonly known as Fox Hill Prison, while prosecutors prepared their case. The allegations drew international attention immediately. A Southern socialite and former beauty pageant contestant, arrested in a foreign country and accused of trying to have her husband killed through WhatsApp, was a narrative the media latched onto quickly. In court filings, prosecutors maintained that the digital evidence spoke for itself. They said the WhatsApp logs showed Lindsay coordinating with the 2 men about killing Rob while he was on the island, and that she sent the message "kill him" as part of the plan. Lindsay and Bethel would later claim publicly that the wording was a figure of speech born from frustration, not an actual murder plot. But the police affidavit summarizing the chats described the conversations as explicit, indicating intent to harm the victim. Bahamian law does not require that money change hands or that actions move beyond planning. Agreement, intent, and overt acts toward the plan, such as communication, identification of the target, or logistical coordination, are enough to constitute a conspiracy. Within weeks of her arrest, Lindsay was granted bail by the Bahamian Supreme Court. She was required to stay in Nassau, wear an electronic monitor, observe a curfew, and report to police multiple times per week. The restrictions were heavy, but she complied long enough to convince the court to allow her to return to the United States under strict conditions. She moved into her parents' home in Abbeville, Alabama, barred from entering Georgia except for court-approved divorce hearings. The judge returned her passport only for sanctioned travel, requiring her to surrender it again upon arrival in the Bahamas for scheduled hearings and trial. But the case did not settle quietly. In late 2024, Lindsay and Bethel gave a joint interview on national television, discussing the charges while the case was still pending. That interview, combined with evidence from Bahamian officers that Lindsay had violated the terms of her residence restrictions, led prosecutors to argue she had breached her bail conditions. A judge agreed and revoked her bail, ordering both Lindsay and Bethel back into custody. The Bahamian Court of Appeal later upheld the revocation, saying the judge acted within the bounds of her authority. It would take additional petitions and hearings before Lindsay's bail was reinstated again in early 2025, allowing her to return once more to Alabama pending trial. The allegations, meanwhile, did not disappear. Bahamian investigators stood by the digital evidence, and prosecutors continued to pursue the case. The trial date moved several times, first to March 2024, then to March 2025, then August, and, according to the most recent scheduling, March 2026. Each delay reflected the complexities of an international case involving travel permissions, bail variations, and legal challenges raised by the defense. Number 8. Makram Kashman. It was late afternoon in Plantation, Florida, when the undercover agent stepped out of his unmarked vehicle and waited beside a row of parked cars. The lot was busy enough to blend into, but quiet enough that no one paid attention to two men meeting near the entrance of a small commercial plaza. Hidden microphones were already running. Surveillance units watched from a distance. This was not a buy, not a drug exchange, and not a routine sting. Federal agents believed that a 58-year-old produce distributor from Boynton Beach had come here for one reason: to finalize arrangements for the killing of a man he described as his business rival. The suspect arrived a few minutes later, walking with purpose, carrying nothing more than a small package of cash and a list of details he had been rehearsing for weeks. According to the criminal complaint, the first meeting had happened 3 weeks earlier, on February 29, 2024. A confidential informant had contacted ATF after hearing from the suspect, Makram Kashman, that he was looking for someone who could take care of a problem. The informant declined to do the job, but agreed to introduce him to a man who supposedly handled violent work for cash. That meeting took place in the same general area of Plantation. The undercover agent acted like a seasoned hitman, asking open questions but offering little. Kashman did most of the talking. He said the intended victim had cheated him, taken over $1 million from him, even stolen a business worth around $3 million. He told the agent that this man had ruined his life and left his family in the streets. When the undercover officer asked what exactly he wanted done, Kashman was clear. He wanted the man dead. By the time they met again on March 19th, agents had already documented enough to show intent, but they kept the operation going to secure physical evidence. That afternoon, in the same parking lot, the undercover agent asked if he had brought the money. Kashman opened the package. Inside was $2,500, half of the agreed $5,000 fee for the killing. He handed it over without hesitation. Then he began providing what federal agents refer to as pattern of life intelligence. He spelled out the victim's first and last name. He described the victim's car, his daily movements, the places he worked out of, and a secluded area in Parkland where he believed the murder could happen without witnesses. When the agent asked if he truly wanted this man killed, the complaint records Kashman responding, "No shit," and adding that he didn't give a fuck how the killing was carried out. For investigators monitoring the exchange, these statements, combined with the money, the specifics of the victim's routine, and the earlier conversation, were enough. There would be no staged death, no fake crime scene photographs, no replication of the Sosa case that had made national headlines years earlier. Within days, ATF agents and U.S. Marshals moved in. Kashman was arrested and booked into the Broward County Jail on a federal charge of using interstate commerce facilities in the commission of murder for hire, a violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1958. The intended victim was never approached, never harmed, and may never have known the plot existed until after the arrest. Makram Kashman was not new to conflict. Public records and interviews indicate that he worked in the South Florida produce industry, a business built on fluctuating margins, perishable goods, and long-standing rivalries. In his version of events, the intended victim was a man who had taken everything from him: money, opportunity, and a business he described as worth millions. Investigators later noted that Kashman's language during the meetings suggested a man driven less by sudden rage and more by sustained resentment and the belief that violence was a legitimate form of repayment. He offered the undercover agent not only a fee, but also permission to keep any cash found on the victim's body, as though the killing were a transaction with room for commission. Nothing in the complaint suggests hesitation or remorse. On October 15, 2024, in federal court in Fort Lauderdale, Kashman stood before a judge and entered a guilty plea. He admitted to meeting the confidential informant, to negotiating a $5,000 murder contract, to paying $2,500 up front, and to providing the victim's identifying and logistical information. Federal prosecutors told the court that he faced up to 10 years in prison, the statutory maximum for a murder-for-hire charge when no injury or death occurs. According to later regional reporting, he ultimately received a sentence of 6 years in federal custody, to be followed by supervision after release. In the end, the operation unraveled not because of a mistake at the last moment, but because every moment of it had been controlled by agents from the start. The hitman was an ATF undercover officer. The first person Cashman approached was already working with federal authorities. The meetings were recorded. The payment was documented. The statements of intent were preserved in transcripts. And the man he wanted dead never even crossed paths with the plot designed to end his life. Makram Cashman believed he was paying for revenge, something permanent, final, and deserved. What he actually purchased was evidence, cash exchanged on camera, detailed instructions provided to a federal agent, and a sequence of deliberate steps that prosecutors later described as unmistakable intent to commit murder. The scheme failed before a single act of violence occurred, leaving only one life altered in a meaningful way. The would-be mastermind now serving years in federal prison for a killing that never happened. Number 9. Mohammed Chowdhury. It began on a cold January evening in Boston, the kind of night when most people hurry indoors, pulling their collars tight against the wind. But inside a parked car tucked into a quiet corner of a commercial lot, 46-year-old Mohammed Chowdhury leaned forward in the passenger seat, speaking in a low, urgent voice to a man he believed was a contract killer. The two men had met before, several times in December and again earlier that month. But tonight was different. Tonight, Chowdhury had brought cash, a deposit, and a final confirmation of what he wanted done. He unfolded two photographs with steady hands, one of his ex-wife, the mother of his children, and the other of her new boyfriend. He placed them on the center console. The man across from him, an FBI undercover agent, didn't rush. He asked questions the way professional hitmen do in stings like this, slowly, repeatedly, allowing the subject to reveal not just intent, but resolve. Chowdhury didn't hesitate. "No evidence," he said. "No evidence that I did something." He wanted them robbed, beaten, gone. He agreed to pay $8,000 for both murders, $4,000 each, and handed over $500 as a down payment. From the outside, the meeting looked uneventful. A brief conversation between two men, but federal agents surrounding the area knew the significance of that moment. That exchange of money, combined with the photos, the schedules, the addresses, the instructions, marked the point where the sting operation crossed into a prosecutable federal crime under Title 18, United States Code, Section 1958. Within minutes, agents swarmed the car, pulled Chowdhury out, and placed him under arrest for a murder-for-hire plot that prosecutors would later describe as an extreme form of domestic violence. The roots of the plot stretched back years. Chowdhury's marriage had ended badly, the divorce fracturing into restraining orders, accusations, and a custody dispute he believed he was losing. In 2019, he was charged with violating an abuse prevention order after repeated attempts to contact his ex-wife. A Massachusetts court gave him a conditional path to avoid conviction, but the resentment didn't fade. According to a cooperating witness, Chowdhury spent months talking about how his ex-wife had ruined his life, how she controlled access to the children, how her westernization and independent thinking was destroying their family. The witness told authorities that Chowdhury wanted her dead and that he had even paid someone once before, only to have the money taken without the killing ever happening. When the witness approached law enforcement in late 2022, they acted quickly. The FBI Boston Violent Crimes Task Force launched a controlled operation. Agents obtained Chowdhury's phone number and began a dialogue through a man he believed could solve his problem. Soon after, Chowdhury was introduced, under carefully monitored circumstances, to the undercover hitman. Throughout December 2022 and January 2023, there were multiple meetings. Each was recorded. At one meeting, Chowdhury explained that he wanted the boyfriend killed first. "He is the obstacle," he said. He described where the man worked, the path he took from the subway, the hours he left home. For his ex-wife, he provided workplace information and daily movements. He insisted the murders look like a robbery or beating, not an assassination. He asked the undercover agent, "So how are we gonna disappear his, body?" He kept coming back to the same refrain, "No evidence. No evidence that I did something." The recordings captured more than planning. They captured the worldview behind the plot, anger, jealousy, and a belief that violence would restore the power he had lost. At one point, he told agents he would rob a store if that's what it took to get the money for the murders. At another, he said that once the boyfriend was dead, his ex-wife would be alone and therefore easier to eliminate. By the time he arrived at the final meeting on the 17th of January 2023, the FBI had more than enough evidence. Chowdhury confirmed the agreement, placed the deposit in the undercover agent's hand, and restated that he wanted both killings done. That was the moment agents moved in. In January 2024, facing overwhelming recordings and evidence, Chowdhury pleaded guilty in federal court to 2 counts of murder for hire. At sentencing in April 2024, prosecutors emphasized that he had demonstrated clear and persistent determination to have 2 people killed, describing the case as a chilling escalation of domestic control violence. Judge Leo T. Sorokin sentenced him to 92 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. No one died. The undercover operation prevented the plot from leaving the planning phase. But the materials he produced, photos, routes, schedules, instructions, made prosecutors' case straightforward. Chowdhury's own words filled in the rest. A man consumed by resentment, certain that the solution to his problems required the elimination of 2 people he once shared a life with. In the end, the only thing that separated Chowdhury from becoming a double murderer was the fact that the hitman he trusted was an FBI agent. Everything else, his intent, his planning, his payment, his readiness, was real. Number 10. Lindsay Foyt. It was just after sunset in the parking lot of the Fox River Mall in Appleton, Wisconsin, when 43-year-old Lindsay Foyt climbed into the passenger seat of a car she believed belonged to a contract killer. The lot was crowded, shoppers moving in and out beneath the glow of the overhead lamps, but inside the vehicle, everything was still. Foyt brought with her a small envelope of photographs, images of her mother and stepfather, taken on ordinary days, smiling, unaware that their daughter had decided they needed to die. She looked at the man beside her, an undercover officer posing as a hitman, and began explaining how she wanted the killings done. Poison was her first choice. Something slipped into their morning coffee, she said, something that would not show up on an autopsy. She mentioned Visine, then oleander, convinced from online rumors and half-remembered anecdotes that the toxins would pass as a natural medical event. If poison didn't work, she said, there were other options: a fall in the shower, staged to look like an accident, or a burglary, where valuables would be taken to make the break-in appear authentic. She told the undercover officer that her stepfather kept a nice emerald ring in a safe in the basement. He could take it, she said. It would complete the scene. But poison was still her preference. It needs to look natural, she explained, her voice steady as she laid out the plan. The road to that parking lot began months earlier, when Foyt confided in a friend that she wanted her mother dead. The friend, later known in the criminal complaint as a confidential informant, told investigators Foyt had been holding onto a grievance since childhood. When she was 7 years old, she claimed, a neighbor had assaulted her. She said she told her mother, but, according to her, nothing was ever done. No police report, no confrontation, no protection. That memory calcified into bitterness, and the bitterness took shape as revenge. There needs to be a price to pay, she allegedly said. They ruined my life. Foyt did not speak only of anger. She spoke about money, too, an inheritance she believed would amount to a couple $1 million. She offered the undercover officer $10,000 up front and another $10,000 after the murders, promising that once she collected her inheritance, she would pay him $100,000 so he would be happy. The combination of revenge and greed, the emotional wound from childhood and the financial life she imagined afterward, gave the plot its shape. Investigators, now fully aware of her intentions, directed the informant to arrange a controlled meeting. The undercover officer came prepared, trained to ask questions that would reveal not just what the suspect wanted, but how committed they were to seeing it done. Foyt did not hesitate. She provided photos of her mother and stepfather, details about their vehicles, the layout of their home, the location of their bedroom, and the timing of their morning routines. She said it made the most sense for her stepfather to die first. Once he's gone, she explained, it will make her easier. The officer asked whether Foyt was sure she wanted to go through with it. She was. She repeated the terms. She reaffirmed the plan. She restated her motives. Nothing wavered. Minutes after she stepped out of the vehicle, officers closed in and placed her under arrest. In August 2025, Wisconsin prosecutors charged Voigt with 2 counts of conspiracy to commit first-degree intentional homicide. The complaint detailed the sting operation, the statements she made, the methods she suggested, and the money she offered. Court filings painted a portrait of calculated planning rather than impulsive rage, a woman who sought out a killer, negotiated payment, and crafted a narrative for how the deaths should appear. Voigt appeared in court several times in the months that followed. She waived her preliminary hearing, was ordered to stand trial, and is scheduled for arraignment on December 10, 2025. As of the latest filings, she has not entered a plea, and no trial date has been set. Her case remains open, her alleged intentions preserved in transcripts, recordings, and statements that now form the heart of the prosecution. Her mother and stepfather are alive because the man she believed was a hitman was an undercover officer, and because the friend she confided in chose to go to police instead of walking away. Everything else, the planned poisonings, the staged accidents, the promise of inheritance money, remained trapped in the planning phase, undone by the sting operation designed to reveal her intent. In the end, the only violence in this case was the violence she described, calmly and methodically, inside a parked car, under the fluorescent glow of a mall parking lot, believing all the while that she was arranging the deaths of the 2 people who had raised her. These cases show a pattern that repeats across states, countries, and decades. Murder for hire plots almost never succeed, not because the masterminds lose their nerve, but because their own planning exposes them long before any violence occurs. Some were undone by undercover officers posing as hitmen. Others were caught by digital messages, recorded meetings, or friends who refused to stay silent. What they all shared was the belief that killing someone could solve a personal problem: marriages, divorces, jealousy, money, inheritance, revenge. Instead of eliminating their targets, each plotter destroyed their own life. Long prison sentences, federal indictments, national exposure, and families shattered by the discovery of what they were willing to do. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more verified true crime investigations every week. Stay safe. Until next time.